Today, I'm going to remove all the men from the Earth except for one. That means there will be 4 billion women and only one man left on Earth. Then, Pax Historia's AI will simulate everything that happens next for humanity. Is it going to be chaos? Will the human species survive? You know what? Just to stir things up a bit, I told the AI that our man already has a girlfriend before the catastrophe. Maybe that's going to create a bit of jealousy or even resentment. Here we go, we're in France, and as always, we start on January 1st, 2026, A Silent World, The Disappearance of Men. It's January 1st, 2026. The New Year's bells are still ringing in Paris when Jean-Paul Eudes Edouard, I admit I was dumb to pick such a long name, so let's call him JPE. At 25, he wakes up in his Paris apartment beside his girlfriend. He doesn't know it yet, but he is now the last man alive on Earth. News from all over the world starts pouring in. Hospitals are reporting abnormal male mortality, governments are holding emergency meetings, and millions of women are trying to reach their male loved ones without success. The silence of men spreads over the planet like a shadow. Well, first of all, I see two problems. The first one, obviously, is about the survival of the species. It's going to be hard for humanity to avoid extinction, but the real mystery is that half of all humans vanished instantly. I think that throws everything into chaos in pretty much every part of society. The next day, January 2nd, 2026, the French authorities declare a national health emergency. Faced with alarming reports flooding health services all over France, the French government declares a national health emergency. The hospitals are in shock, and female doctors, soldiers, and civil servants are trying to maintain order. In Paris, Jean-Paul anxiously notices that his phone keeps ringing. His male friends aren't answering, and he can't reach his brother in Lyon. It's odd for him to try on January 2nd, but maybe his brother was too hungover on January 1st to notice. It's only on January 3rd that we see a cascading collapse of male-led institutions worldwide. What are male-led institutions worldwide? I get global institutions, but male-led institutions? The WHO, the World Men's Health Organization? All over the world, governments and institutions dominated by men are quietly collapsing. So wait, just out of curiosity, how many countries are led by women around the world? As of January 1st, 2026, there are 28 countries where 30 women are heads of state and government. In this situation, maybe we would have benefited from having gender parity. Just saying, the United States, Russia, China, every major power is facing a sudden and catastrophic void of male leaders. Global news channels are constantly showing empty government headquarters and silent military barracks. In France, Jean-Paul turns on the TV and sees the scale of the phenomenon for the first time. A female presenter announces with a broken voice that men are disappearing everywhere in the world. Have all the men disappeared from the world, or are they disappearing little by little? No, because that's not the same thing. Jean-Paul realizes that he is alone. Jean-Paul walks through the streets of Paris with his girlfriend. The city is strangely quiet. No more male voices in the cafes, no more men in the subway. His girlfriend squeezes his hand. She understood before he did. Honestly, it kind of gives you the chills, doesn't it? Interesting topic. The couple dynamic here must feel strange for both protagonists. Social media is buzzing. Women worldwide share stories about men vanishing from their circles. Jean-Paul posts on his social media. Within seconds, he receives thousands of responses from stunned women. Some are in disbelief, some in tears. He really is the only one. Obviously, all of this creates a power vacuum in governments around the world. That's why, in a historic turn, women take over governments worldwide. The Prime Minister in France and the Vice President in the United States. A female government official seizes control of the Kremlin in Russia. The United Nations headquarters in New York falls into chaos, prompting an emergency UN session in Paris, the city where Earth's only known living man resides. Biologists, geneticists, and demographers are urgently consulted as everyone discusses Jean-Paul and his impact on humanity's future, even though his name is not yet officially known to the general public. But is it really such a problem for the survival of the human species? If I'm not mistaken, there are already sperm banks that must exist. I'm not very familiar with the subject, but it could be a first lead. And then, as a second option, we could ask Jean-Paul to provide, yeah, I don't need to spell it out for you, okay? Alright, anyway, for now, we're still dealing with something very serious. The French Secret Services have located Jean-Paul. The French General Directorate for Internal Security, by cross-referencing social media data and hospital records, locates Jean-Paul. A team of agents shows up at his door, and his shocked girlfriend lets them in. Jean-Paul is informed in terms both gentle and solemn that he is now considered humanity's most precious asset. The guy was still in his underwear in his living room, though. He is quickly put under government protection. Jean-Paul is silent for a while before asking, "Can I keep my phone?" He doesn't want to lose his Clash of Clans streak. I'm not sure if Clash of Clans has streaks since I've never played, but you get the idea. After that, Jean-Paul and his girlfriend are escorted under a discreet but heavy guard to a secure wing of the Élysée Palace. The French government sees his presence in the country as an unprecedented geopolitical issue. I'm not sure if having this in France is good or bad, since it might cause tension. At that moment, the world reacts with mourning, panic, and hope, holding its breath. In Brazil, millions of women hold nighttime candlelight vigils. In India, temples fill with weeping worshippers. In China, the government issues a brief statement about the exceptional biological situation. As for Russia, it mobilizes its intelligence services. According to diplomatic sources, Moscow is actively seeking genetic or biological information about Jean-Paul. Everywhere, collective mourning coexists with a pressing existential question. Can humanity still perpetuate itself? Well, until proven otherwise, people can still reproduce, right? It's just that it might be complicated to produce 8 billion people to keep the population on Earth at the same level. That I can believe. Or here's a crazy idea, a wild plot twist. Jean-Paul is sterile. Now that man, I admit, that would be a rough moment for humanity. Then again, just because the men are gone doesn't mean pregnant women aren't still pregnant. I'm going to ask the AI that. Are pregnant women still pregnant? If so, we just need to wait 18 years for genetic repopulation. For now, it's a big question mark. Yes, I believe the AI is shocked by what I'm saying. My lord, forgive my silence. The question unsettled me because it strikes at the core of our situation. Did I ask a weird question or something? Yes, most likely. Women who were already pregnant as of January 1st, 2026 should, according to biological logic, be able to carry their pregnancy to term. Apparently, it only affected men who were already born and not male fetuses in utero, although that still needs to be confirmed for sure. Well, there you go. There's absolutely no problem. Jean-Paul, you can go back to playing League of Legends. On January 8th, scientists publish an initial assessment. The fate of humanity rests on biology and time. International scientific teams, assembled by the UN in Paris, release a preliminary assessment. The disappearance of men seems caused by an unknown biological phenomenon. Thank you, science. Seriously, we'll raise your salaries. Let's go. If we don't find a solution soon, natural reproduction will be impossible in a few generations. Jean-Paul hears the news in his Élysée salon and gazes at the empty gardens. His girlfriend rests a hand on his shoulder as he murmurs something just for her. What did you say to your girlfriend, Jean-Paul? Humanity's survival depends on it. Well, not really, since there are pregnant women, so it's fine. This video is so weird, you can really take things out of context. Here's what happened the first week after all the men disappeared. Now, I'll skip ahead a month to see the current situation. The world's largest teams of virologists, geneticists, and biologists, now entirely women, are publishing their first major hypotheses. Three main theories stand out. A silently transmitted virus targeting the Y chromosome. So then, in that case, why did Jean-Paul manage to survive? Or maybe Jean-Paul is secretly a woman. A massive epigenetic dysregulation or an as yet unknown phenomenon. Thank you, science. The laboratories at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, in direct contact with the UN teams stationed in the capital, are on the front lines. Jean-Paul from the Élysée learns that biological samples will soon be requested from him. What are biological samples? He accepts silently, his gaze lost toward the window. On a basic level, what happens if he says, well, no guys, you're on your own with your mess, I'm going home. In this situation, would we respect human rights and say, okay, well, that's your choice, you know? Or would we say, no, this is about the survival of humanity? And that's exactly when things start to go off the rails. Diplomatic tension. Several nations are demanding access to Jean-Paul. They want access, you know? The thing is, well, it's like ChatGPT. Russia, China, and the United States each send a formal diplomatic note to Paris, demanding access. In various terms, I'd really like to know what those various terms are, to Jean-Paul. Moscow talks about a bilateral scientific cooperation protocol. Washington mentions a shared responsibility of humanity. In your opinion, if it were an American, would they talk about a shared responsibility of humanity? Not sure. Beijing requests a medical delegation, but the French Foreign Ministry firmly replies that Jean-Paul is a free French citizen. Honestly, I wonder if it's actually positive or not for France that the last man on Earth is in France. This could cause major diplomatic issues later. And honestly, there's a scenario where Jean-Paul isn't safe from being killed by the United States. Jean-Paul is a free French citizen, not a shared global asset. All scientific cooperation must occur within the UN framework set in Paris. Still, I think that's a fairly reasonable answer. Jean-Paul meets the UN delegations for the first time. In the quiet Élysée Palace room, Jean-Paul meets United Nations representatives for the first time. Witnesses say he appears calm, yet clearly overwhelmed by the situation. No wonder. He struggles with dishes, and now the fate of humanity is on him. I'd be terrified too. His girlfriend sometimes speaks for him while the delegations explain what's at stake. Assisted reproduction, pre-disaster sperm banks, and the key issue of his voluntary involvement in a genetic preservation program. This is the part I was concerned about in the video, as we might discuss dark stories. Please know I'm not responsible, I only gave the AI the initial prompt. Jean-Paul asks for more time to think, and the delegations agree. The issue is that the AI isn't clear about its request to Jean-Paul. For example, what does assisted reproduction really mean? Is it like in vitro fertilization? In that case, I think it's pretty reasonable. Meanwhile, riots are breaking out in several world capitals due to the lack of information. In Lagos, Karachi, Jakarta, and Mexico City, large-scale protests are turning into riots. Thousands of women, angry about the lack of government transparency regarding the situation, are storming official buildings. Honestly, those poor people can't know what's happening, especially since it's in another country. If France doesn't inform India, there wouldn't be much they could say. But hey, If I were Jean-Paul, the crazy idea I just had is to create a YouTube channel and then, literally the whole world would subscribe to me. Can you imagine how many views that could get? On January 17, 2026, the answer comes in. Jean-Paul agrees to take part in the UN scientific program. After several days of thinking and long conversations with his girlfriend, Jean-Paul announces through the French government that he agrees to voluntarily take part in the scientific program coordinated by the UN. So, what does that mean? Tell us, Jean-Paul, okay? Stop being so secretive, otherwise it causes riots as you've seen. However, he sets clear conditions. Respect for his privacy, his girlfriend being allowed to stay with him at all times, and no obligations of any kind beyond biological sampling. Okay, so from what I understand, there will be biological samples taken that will be used for reproduction. We get it, Jean-Paul, we see where you're going with this. The French Prime Minister welcomes his decision with visible emotion. Around the world, the news is received as a ray of hope. Honestly, Jean-Paul, there was a chance to stir things up to say, sorry guys, no, it's actually good news, but obviously not everyone is happy about it. Especially Russia, which is deploying unusual intelligence resources around Paris. Sources within European intelligence services are quietly alerting Paris. The Russian Federation is said to have deployed several SVR agents in the Paris region, their objective to collect biological or personal information about Jean-Paul or even try to approach him directly. And damn, the guy, the pressure he must be under, huh? The Prime Minister summons the Russian ambassador and informs him that any act or attempt at interference will be considered a hostile act. So, is the war still going on between Russia and Ukraine now that there are no more men? Is Russia still at war with Ukraine? Probably not. At least not in the same way. The sudden disappearance of nearly all male soldiers on both sides made conventional military operations impossible overnight. But women can fight too, you know. The Russian and Ukrainian armies, made up overwhelmingly of men, collapsed structurally between January 1st and 3rd. Well, it makes sense that on the front lines, most of the time it's men, so unless one side decides to enlist women and advance on the front lines, it's normal that nothing is happening. But I have a feeling they've got bigger fish to fry at this point. Especially since, technically, it seems to me that the special operation against Ukraine is still kind of Putin's thing. Putin, being a man, is no longer there. And actually, there are quite a few other problems. The global financial markets are collapsing. We had to wait until January 22, 2026, a tweet from Trump moves the markets instantly, but if all humans vanished, it would take 3 weeks for the markets to collapse. Unsurprisingly, the economic consequences of the disappearance of men are starting to be felt with unexpected brutality. Entire sectors of industry, construction, heavy transport, the military are paralyzed. The global financial markets, already in free fall since January 2nd, okay, I was being harsh, are reaching historically low levels. The IMF and the World Bank, whose leadership has been urgently taken over by their female executives, if I'm not mistaken, the IMF is already led by a woman. That's one less problem to deal with. In any case, they are publishing an alarming report stating that a deep and unavoidable global recession will occur by the first quarter of 2026. France is trying its best to stabilize its economy. Well, anyway, whether it's a woman or a man, things are a mess in France no matter what. So, there's no problem. It's fair. Now, what's interesting is the situation of Jean-Paul. Between fame and a gilded prison, an intimate testimony. A personal diary kept by Jean-Paul since his arrival at the Elysee has started to circulate. The guy doesn't get a second of rest. Some excerpts are said to have been given to a journalist. The government immediately denies everything officially. These fragments show a 25-year-old torn between his huge role and his old life. His missing friends, simple habits, evenings watching shows with his girlfriend, and being stuck in bronze in League of Legends. No, I made up that last part, you caught it. I'm not a hero, I'm just the only one left, it's different. The whole world stops for a moment to read these words, and something changes in the collective perception of Jean-Paul. And what changes? There's no time to feel sorry for Jean-Paul, he has work to do. First meeting of the Security Council for Humanity held in Paris, and a new body is created under UN auspices. Bringing together representatives from the 15 most populous nations in the world, its headquarters are established in Paris, a city considered the geopolitical center of this unprecedented crisis. Its goal is to coordinate to prevent humanity's collapse. Meanwhile, China announces it has the world's largest male genetic material bank. I like how they still present it positively. A large bank of male genetic material. Saying it that way almost makes it sound less disgusting. The Chinese government unexpectedly announced it had secretly built the largest male genetic material bank, with samples from millions of men before and during the crisis. This announcement brings both relief and deep mistrust. You have to admit, China plays poker well. They waited a month to announce this, like just to make sure things were really chaotic in the world, and then they say, don't worry, we've got the solution. No, Jean-Paul, you're out. You're not useful anymore. Some nations accuse Beijing of having anticipated the disaster, raising dizzying questions. Maybe that's true. But on the other hand, what would be their interest in making all men disappear? Since the top leader of the Chinese nation is a man, it would be like suicide. A global women's movement demands democratic governance to ensure humanity's survival. Their central demand is that decisions concerning the continuation of the human species be made democratically by and for women. Technically, though, if someone makes a decision, as long as it's not Jean-Paul, it will be a decision made by a woman. So either way, the decision will be made by women. Jean-Paul watches from his room, arms crossed, with no visible expression. But seriously, if Jean-Paul goes out into the street, it must be total chaos. It's like if Mr. Beast goes to an airport. Obviously, not every everything could go smoothly. First signs of tension between France and the United States emerge, revealing initial diplomatic fractures in the new Security Council for Humanity. The United States, through their newly sworn-in president, demands that Jean-Paul be transferred to an international medical center. There you go, bravo Americans, you lasted a month and a week. Yay. Yes, they wanted to be on American soil? Well, of course, otherwise it wouldn't be any fun. The International Medical Center of Freedom. The French Prime Minister is direct. Jean-Paul is French, he lives in France, he will stay as long as he wishes. I have a feeling an American helicopter will visit us soon to bring democracy, so don't panic. Now let's fast forward the simulation 6 months to see what happens. So, the first resolution of the Humanity Security Council has been adopted. The establishment of a global program for the conservation of male genetic heritage. Well, the Chinese have already done it, no need. It requires each signatory nation to submit its biological databases for an independent international audit. I'm not sure how an audit helps repopulate the Earth, but I don't know. Maybe that's what they want, since there will be an issue. If we use Jean-Paul's genetic material so that technically Jean-Paul would be the father of every child born from now on, there could be some issues with inbreeding. It's the same problem we had in that video where only 2 humans were left on Earth. North Korea collapses and the Pyongyang regime disappears quietly. Without male leadership or a succession plan, North Korea's isolated regime collapses quietly, so it becomes South Korea. Honestly, it still lasted a month and a half. Now it's truly chaotic. On February 27, 2026, Jean-Paul falls ill. An unexplained fever causes worldwide panic. Can you imagine? This is really something. There must be every doctor in the world at Jean-Paul's bedside right now. He is bedridden by a sudden unexplained fever. Within hours, news likely leaks from medical circles at the Elysee, sending a global shockwave. The already low markets collapse further. I admit it's stressful, but fortunately, we have China's reserves. Thousands of women spontaneously gather in front of the Elysee in grim silence. Jean-Paul later wrote in his journal, "I never realized my cough could shake the world. It's a terrible feeling. Honestly, everyone must be on edge." But wait, Jean-Paul, you're not adding more salt to your meat, are you? That's risky. Watch the sugar too. 3 days later, doctors confirm it was only a seasonal flu. Honestly, no, really, the pressure on poor Jean-Paul. Russia breaks with the Security Council of Humanity and announces its own program. The Russian government dramatically announces its withdrawal from the UNSCH framework and launches its own national biological program. The Russians are going to make things complicated, huh? I don't know if you've noticed, but you don't actually have any men at your place. You're forced to go through our projects. Nazis from the ELV, still just as bad at translating, huh? Moscow claims it has enough genetic material to ensure the continuation of its Russian population without international help. Honestly, that's probably for the best, huh? That will create genetic diversity and potentially prevent problems in the future. Then we get to April 3rd, 2026, and something extremely strange happens. The first post-crisis births from assisted reproduction have been announced. Actually, I already find 2 things very strange. Earlier, we were told that there were still pregnant women who could potentially give birth to men. Now, on April 3rd, there should already be thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of men who have already been born. Actually, even millions. What am I saying? But here, they mainly report that clinics in the United States, Germany, and South Korea are announcing the first successful pregnancies from medically assisted reproduction. All of this using sperm stocks collected before January 2026. But, wait, just because it's assisted doesn't mean it takes less than 9 months to have a child. You're a bit off track, you know? April, month of the year. 4th month in the calendar. The math isn't very good here. The announcement is met with immense worldwide joy and tears in many households. Scientists caution that existing stocks are limited, and without new genetic material, opportunities for assisted reproduction will decrease. Also, if births occur, there's a 50-50 chance of males. The pressure on Jean-Paul intensifies, implicitly but noticeably. On April 17, Jean-Paul speaks publicly for the first time. He talks for 9 minutes with a hesitant but sincere voice. He discusses his lost friends, father, brothers, and girlfriend. He insists he's not a symbol but a man, which is important. Billions watch the broadcast and millions of women cry at their screens. It's the most watched speech in human history. All that just to say nothing, huh? Listen, Jean-Paul, we only need you for one thing. I don't need to spell it out for you. There's a bit of tension here involving Jean-Paul's girlfriend that caught my attention from the start. My theory is that if this ever happens in real life, there's a good chance that if only one man is left, the couple won't last. We'll see what happens. For the first time, the name and face of Jean-Paul's girlfriend are revealed to the public. Honestly, it's a little scary because if I were her, I wouldn't feel reassured at all. I think there are quite a few people who would want to kill her. Her name is Elise Marchand, 24, a literature student. Her face is on the front page of every newspaper in the world. She instantly becomes globally famous and deeply disliked by some in the Les Héritières movement. Even the name suggests they're unfriendly. They accuse her of having unfair and exclusive access to Jean-Paul. I'm knocked out, like Jean-Paul is really the new oil, you know? Conflicting hashtags are flooding social media. Elise doesn't make any public statements. Jean-Paul, on the other hand, is furious about this intrusion. Things are starting to heat up for our lovebirds, huh? The DGSI announces that they have foiled a kidnapping attempt targeting Jean-Paul. The whole thing was carried out by an unidentified group operating from the outskirts of Paris. 4 people have been arrested. The French secret services won't confirm or deny any supposed ties to Russian intelligence or a private group. If they failed, it wasn't the Americans. We'll meet again on July 29, 2026. And we have information that humanity has between 40 and 80 years left before extinction if no solution is found. But wait, weren't there births in the meantime, especially of boys? So I don't know why, but he explains to me that if there are births and boys are born and survive, it would mean that the phenomenon doesn't affect future births. If boys are born and die soon after, that's a disaster. Thanks, I understand. But have there been any births? This doesn't look good. Here's what's happening. A large majority of boys born since July do not survive. Doctors describe rapid organ failure similar but not identical to the phenomenon from January 1st. However, a few isolated cases of apparently viable boys have been reported, notably in South Korea and Germany. How many men/boys are currently on Earth? In practice, between 1 and a few dozen males alive on a planet of nearly 8 billion women. What do you mean 8 billion women? With 8 billion people, if men disappear, there'd be about 4 billion women. Never trust AI? It talks nonsense, right? That's right, about 4 billion. Guess I'm not crazy. Well, in any case, the report tells us that humanity should go extinct between 2066 and 2106. The report becomes the most read document in history. And still, always exaggerating, huh? These AIs. Do people ever read reports? They'll just watch short TikToks that sum them up. It's August 8th now, so let's see what happens in a year. The first thing that happens, obviously, is that the Global Extinction Report triggers a wave of collective despair. In many countries, psychological helplines are overwhelmed with calls. In Paris, Jean-Paul tells Elise he can't bear watching TV anymore. Every show, debate, and headline brings him back to the same question, him. He begins refusing UN delegations on certain days and isolates himself in silence, worrying his doctors. Imagine if he ran away and vanished into the forest. If I were him, I'd do that. It'd make a great story. So, we find our famous heiresses movement again, and some of them demand that Jean-Paul be legally required to contribute genetically, while another fiercely defends his individual rights. Honestly, it's a real question actually, because from an individual point of view, well, it's true that he has the right to do what he wants, but on the other hand, well, the guy is all alone up against 4 billion women. Isn't there? It's complicated. Honestly, it's very complicated. France is closely monitoring the debates, knowing that an overly radical resolution could threaten its own soil. Russia announces the first births from the Nasl Nasleg project. I can't pronounce it. State channels show images of infants as proof that the Russian program is viable. The international community responds skeptically to the announcement, with many biologists questioning the data's authenticity. Meanwhile, the CSH in Paris, that's the Committee for the Survival of Humanity, demands independent verification, which Moscow categorically refuses. But the question everyone is asking is, are there any boys among them, and are they surviving? On October 14, 2026, Jean-Paul announced through the French government that he had made an official biological donation as part of the UN program. Hadn't he already done it? He agreed 6 months ago, and they waited that long to donate? Still, I said humanity remains in a severe emergency. The news provokes radically opposite reactions around the world. Scenes of joy and tears in many capitals, but also an outcry from part of the heiresses movement, who consider the conditions to be unequal and opaque. After all this pressure on Jean-Paul, of course, it will potentially push humanity to try to find other ways to survive. For example, the partial synthesis of the Y chromosome. Beijing announces what its scientists describe as a historic breakthrough. Their teams have reportedly managed to partially synthesize Y chromosome sequences in the lab. If true, this is a major advance toward reproduction without a male donor. Goodbye, Jean-Paul, you're no longer needed. Western scientists are reacting with a mix of excitement and caution. So, is there like physically something that would prevent us from doing this? Or is it just that we don't do it because it would be too expensive compared to the benefit? I don't know, I'm not a scientist, I'm a YouTuber. In any case, take everything said in this video with a grain of salt. I mean, it's also a bit of a sensitive topic. So here we are at the end of the year, December 31, 2026, which means it's been a year since the disaster happened. The demographic estimates are terrifying. The world population has dropped by about 4 billion due to the disappearance of men. The global economies are running slowly, but there are also births in this toll, the first since the crisis. And of course, what we want to know is whether any of them are boys. And a collective determination that if it can't erase the pain, at least keeps humanity standing. In Paris, Jean-Paul and Elise are watching the fireworks from a window at the Elysee. I need to know if there are any boys. I can't take it. Are there any boys being born? What's quite interesting is that the Chinese breakthrough on the Y chromosome is partially genuine. The synthesized sequences are real, but incomplete and not yet usable for human reproduction. They haven't achieved reproduction without men yet, but they're still working on it. The world keeps turning and geopolitical interests persist. Military tension grows in the South China Sea as Beijing quietly expands its naval naval presence. We haven't discussed this involvement much, aside from the war in Ukraine, but China is quietly expanding its naval presence in the South China Sea, taking advantage of the global strategic vacuum caused by the crisis. I think other countries might have bigger fish to fry than defending their international waters. The crisis hasn't erased geopolitics, it's only made it more complex. Ouch. July 14th, 2027, on the day of the national holiday, Jean-Paul makes a shocking personal decision. He asks to leave the Elysee. He wants to leave the Elysee apartments and return to an ordinary Paris apartment with Elise, under protection but free from the stifling protocol. He mentions his mental health, right to dignity, and that 2 years of luxurious confinement have reached their limit. Living next to Jean-Paul must be unsettling. Now, let's jump ahead 3 years to see what happens. First of all, in September, Jean-Paul finally manages to leave the Elysee. Apparently, it was a bit complicated. He moves in with Elise Marchand in an apartment in the 16th arrondissement of Paris. Well, look at that, my dear Jean-Paul isn't holding back. What's Jean-Paul's fortune? Honestly, I think he just has to write a book and he'll become a multimillionaire. The French government covers all his needs. Housing, security, medical care, food. He hardly spends anything. And then we wonder why we're in debt. Jean-Paul mooching off the system. For the first time in almost 2 years, I heard street noises. A barking dog? Well, I often hear the barking dog, a window slamming. It's silly, but I cried. The victim, poor guy. I'm the only one laughing. Nothing about this is working. Still, it's not just the Chinese working. We've had a major European breakthrough. With emergency spring funding, French researchers published a Nature article detailing for the first time the exact molecular process behind the disappearance of men. A retrovirus, damn, I can't even read it. An endogenous retrovirus activated by an environmental cofactor that's still unidentified. But damn, how did I not think of that? Of course, an environmental co-virus. I can't even make my joke. Well, that's cool. We have the cause of the problem, but we don't have the solution. Meanwhile, more and more countries are collapsing, and so we reach the second anniversary of the disaster. In Paris, Jean-Paul and Elise attend a private ceremony in their building's courtyard with the security guards who have protected them for months. No speeches this time. Jean-Paul just lights a candle and sets it on the windowsill. A neighbor's photo shared online spreads worldwide in hours. Well then, there are some minor dramas regarding China's research, and what's especially interesting is that on April 22, 2028, we have the first verified birth resulting from Jean-Paul's donation. 3 births are announced simultaneously. In Paris, Lyon, and Montreal, Quebecers, I had to. Everything was kept secret to protect the families. Later, when they see a boy walking around, they'll realize something's off. The news is made public with the consent of the mothers involved. The whole world comes to a halt. Scenes of rare emotional intensity unfold in all the capitals. Jean-Paul hears the news over the phone in his kitchen, a cup of coffee in his hand. Elise says he was silent for minutes, then said, "Hello, world. Are there any boys?" No one has any sense of priorities in this simulation. Now the AI did something and I'm unsure what to think. On September 11, 2028, the AI tells me that there was a foiled attack against Jean-Paul. A cell linked to members of the Earth was arrested. 4 people were preparing a coercive action targeting Jean-Paul in his Paris apartment. Not an assassination, but an attempted kidnapping for reproductive purposes. The anxiety. It's really like the sentence, it sends chills down your spine. We may finally have the reason for the disappearance of all the men. Apparently, it's because of a synthetic chemical compound present since the 2010s in certain industrial plastics used for food. The accumulation in the male body triggers the activation of the retrovirus beyond a critical threshold. The discovery is immediately verified by 3 independent laboratories. Paris becomes, in just a few hours, the absolute scientific capital of the world. The bottom line is, it's because of microplastics and forever chemicals. In any case, time moves on and we reach 2029. 3 years after his historic address, Jean-Paul speaks again, more freely and more directly. To mark the 3rd anniversary of his worldwide address, Jean-Paul agrees to a filmed interview. And for the first time, he publicly announces that Elise and he are expecting a child conceived naturally. I like that little detail. Honestly, this story really makes me emotional. I'm genuinely happy for them. It was only a few months later that Jean-Paul and Elise had their child. Elise Marchand gave birth to a boy finally, and she tells us, a perfectly healthy boy in a secure Parisian clinic. By the way, honestly, what's kind of funny is to think that as a result, all the maternity wards must be completely empty. The child, whose first name hasn't been released, is the first boy born naturally since men disappeared in January 2026. You need to get your story straight. As the AI says, natural birth still occurred. After September 2026, I could buy it, to allow time for natural births. It doesn't make sense otherwise. By 2029 or 2030, we start getting good news stories. After identifying the chemical cofactor in November 2028, teams from the Pasteur Institute and an international consortium publish a full preventive protocol. The gradual elimination of the implicated compound from global production lines, combined with an experimental epigenetic treatment that could partially restore the viability of the Y chromosome in male embryos. It shows encouraging but still preliminary results. Now the question I'm asking myself is what happens if I move forward a little, say 7 years. On February 14, 2031, Jean-Paul's son turns 18 months old, a living symbol. Well, first, the good news is that unlike some baby boys, at least Jean-Paul's son isn't dead. Little Adrien Eudes Marchand Edouard, damn, poor kid, he has a really complicated name. He turns 18 months old in relative obscurity. The French government won't reveal his face or first name, which makes sense since he's only 18 months old and can't consent. Still, rumors are spreading. Several foreign newspapers are publishing stolen photos of the family. In the 16th arrondissement, Jean-Paul, in his diary, simply writes, "He looks like everyone else. It's the most normal and miraculous thing in the world. Honestly, it must be a real source of anxiety." I think Jean-Paul just can't walk down the street and go unnoticed. Well then, just because Jean-Paul has children doesn't mean the rest of the international community is sitting around twiddling their thumbs. So, in 2032, 3 boys are born in Seoul, Hamburg, and Toronto, all from embryos treated according to the protocol developed by the Pasteur Consortium. For the first time since January 2026, boys are being born without Jean-Paul's biological contribution. Humanity's outlook is improving, while China accelerates its independent program to challenge the CSH. They had over 400 male births using a Pasteur protocol variant. It's impressive and a bit scary. Jean-Paul gives his second big interview. "I want to disappear." Jean-Paul, everything's fine, humanity is doing well, please don't leave us, said during a filmed France television interview. I like the little detail. Jean-Paul opens up with a moving honesty. He describes 7 years of constant surveillance, international pressure, and threats. "I want the world to forget my name. I want my son to grow up without being a symbol. I just want to disappear into silence." Basically, Jean-Paul is living Squeezy's life. But at the same time, I get it. He didn't ask for any of this, you know. He didn't do a Who is the Imposter episode 32 global assessment 9 years after the disaster. So it's quite interesting because on January 1st, 2035, more than 12,000 male births were reported through epigenetic protocols. The UN estimates that without further intervention, gender parity will not be restored before 2090 at the earliest. Jean-Paul, now 34 years old, lives in relative privacy. His 5-year-old son, Adrien, attends a private elementary school in Paris with his identity partially protected. After all, there can't be many 5-year-olds in Paris after everything that's happened. Jean-Paul and Elise chose a co-ed school, one of the few in France where girls born via assisted reproduction before 2026 attend with the first girls born from the Pasteur protocol. Births continued during that time, but no boys survived due to a fatal gene. Now, for the first time in years, Adrien isn't the only boy. There are 2 other boys in his class. Jean-Paul walks his son to school on the first morning incognito. He comes back to the apartment and cries silently in his kitchen. I don't know if he's crying happy tears or sad tears. Alright, we're back to the bestseller story I mentioned about Jean-Paul. He finally published his memoirs, the only one, with Gallimard, 612 pages translated into 54 languages. What interests me are the numbers. How many copies did his book sell? Estimates from publishers and bookstores mention several tens of millions of copies, potentially between 30 and 60 million. Yeah, that's no joke, right? Personally, I'd really like to know how all these things end. So I'm going to fast forward the simulation by 20 years all at once. So, 12 years after the disaster, we have a total of 47,000 male births. That's good, but on the scale of humanity, it's nothing at all. For every man born, there are still 23 women being born. Yeah, no, it really created a crazy imbalance for the future. The UN is revising its projections. Gender parity won't be restored until between 2095 and 2110 in the best case scenario. Jean-Paul, now 37, remains one of the few adult men still able to reproduce naturally on Earth. Even at 37, he can't wait much longer. We move forward a few years and arrive at July 14, 2044. And for the first time in many years, male soldiers, 47 of them aged 12 to 18, of course they're soldiers at 12 years old. It's a bit creepy, honestly. Those born via the first or epigenetic protocols, or naturally, like Adrien, joined the military parade on the Champs-Élysées. They march with thousands of female soldiers, moving the crowd deeply. Jean-Paul watches the parade on TV from his apartment with 14-year-old Adrien by his side. How is it possible that there are boys who are 18 years old when Adrien is 14? Technically, he's the first boy to be born, if I'm not mistaken. In any case, if there are others who were born, they're not much older than him. Well, it's AI, so it's okay, it makes mistakes. 3 years later, Adrien, now 17, whose identity had been partially protected since childhood, is officially enrolled at Sciences Po Paris under his real name. The news reaches the world press, and within hours, he selects a program in international law and genetic ethics, a choice unsurprising to those familiar with his story. At the same time, science keeps advancing, and now we've reached a viability rate of 97%, which means that at this stage, almost all boys who are born manage to survive. It's a silent but complete revolution. The CSH votes unanimously for an immediate and free worldwide distribution. China, after tough negotiations, agrees. And the good news in 2055 is that thanks to the 4th generation protocol and its massive deployment since 2049, the UN's demographic department is dramatically revising its projections for gender parity. It could be restored as early as 2085, which is 25 years earlier than the most optimistic estimates from 2035. In industrialized countries, including France, the male proportion is expected to reach 15 to 18% as early as 2060. At the same time, Jean-Paul, once the last man on Earth, is turning 56, an ordinary man in a world becoming normal again. Honestly, it gives me chills. morals. That's what's crazy every time in stories where the storytelling is well done. Like, I feel like I've lived his life with him. There she is, Adrian, 27 years old now, a junior diplomat at the CSH and back from New York for the occasion. He also has neighbors, friends, faces who never needed to know who he was. In the streets of Paris, boys play soccer, men take the subway, fathers walk their daughters to school. The world isn't fully healed, but it feels changed. Jean-Paul blows out his candles and makes a wish he keeps to himself. That night, he writes one line in his diary. I was lucky, and I did what I could with that luck. That's all you can ask of a man. There, the last sentence that gives you a little shiver. Afterwards, the question I ask myself is, what does the world's demographics look like? What? The estimated total world population is between 5.5, and 6 billion. Damn, they bounce back really fast. The loss of 4 billion men in 2026, along with years of low birth rates and crises in sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahel, still hasn't been recovered. Still, I think it's quite an achievement, right? Men now make up between 8 and 12% of the world's population, which is between 440 million and 720 million men. That's not bad, right? France is in an exceptionally favorable position for once. That was a great, interesting story. Even if everything these AIs said is fiction, it's fun to imagine scenarios like this. If you want me to do the opposite, you know what to do. Like, subscribe. Bye, this was Fuse. See you next time.